Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. We are going to be busting some myths about learning to speak English.
Should be fun.
Yeah. We're going to be using insights from this really cool English teacher named Mr. Soberg and hearing some stories about his students and what they went through.
I think people will be surprised to find out that a lot of the things that they think are true about learning English are actually just myths.
Totally. It's like a myth-busting mission. You know, we're talking about those beliefs that hold people back from even trying. Things like there being an age limit to learning English, or needing to be like super smart, or thinking that you have to shell out tons of money for these expensive classes.
Where you have to live abroad.
Or that you have to live abroad. So many myths. But we're going to tackle them all head on. All right, so myth number one is that you have to start learning English as a child.
Right.
Like it's too late for adults.
Yeah, a lot of people think that.
Yeah. So Mr. Soberg talks about this student of his, this guy Amir, a 52-year-old taxi driver who really wanted to share his city's history with tourists. But he just felt like it was too late for him. Like he was too old to learn English.
It's so sad how these myths can make us doubt ourselves before we even begin.
Totally. But I love how Mr. Soberg breaks this myth down. He uses this analogy of exercising a muscle.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. It's like whether you start working out at 20 or 50, the muscle's still going to get stronger with use.
It makes so much sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I guess age really is just a number when it comes to learning English.
Absolutely. And Amir is like the perfect example. He started small.
Oh, yeah. Like how?
He started with basic phrases like, "Welcome to my city," or "Where would you like to go?" You know, practical stuff.
I love it.
And then he had this brilliant idea of turning his taxi into a mobile classroom.
Wow. How cool.
Right. So he started practicing with his passengers.
Talk about brave. I can only imagine the reactions he got.
Oh, I'm sure some laughed.
I was going to say.
But many were actually super encouraging.
That's so great.
And that really helped him to keep going, you know, knowing that people were rooting for him. And after 2 years of consistent effort, Amir actually became a top-rated tour guide. Can you believe that?
Wow, that's amazing.
He even said, "I thought I was too old, but now I feel younger than ever."
That's just incredible. I mean, talk about a transformation.
It really shows you how learning a new language can open up so many possibilities.
Totally. So listeners, what dreams could English unlock for you? Don't let age hold you back. It's never too late.
That's so true.
All right, moving on to myth number 2. Learning English is only for the smartest people.
Oh, this one's a big one.
Right. Mr. Soberg shares this story about Layla, an 18-year-old who always felt like she wasn't intelligent enough to learn English. You know, like it was beyond her capabilities. So it's like this idea that you have to be born with this like language gene or something to be good at English.
But Mr. Soberg completely debunks that myth. He says that it's not about being naturally smart. It's about practice, patience, and passion.
So you're saying anyone can learn English, regardless of how they did in school.
Exactly. And Layla's story really proves this point. So she started super small.
No way.
Just 3 new words a day. That's it.
Wow.
From there, she slowly built up to sentences, you know, overcoming those inevitable mistakes along the way. And you know what? Within 3 months, she was having full-blown conversations with her cousin in English.
No way. That's awesome.
Right. And here's the really cool part. Layla had always struggled in school. Like, she wasn't what people would typically call a straight-A student.
That makes it even more inspiring. So if she can do it, anyone can.
Seriously.
Yeah.
So listeners, don't underestimate yourselves. You have the power to learn English, I promise.
I love that. Okay, let's talk about a myth that I think a lot of people worry about.
Yeah.
You need expensive classes to learn English.
Ooh, yeah, money.
Money. Like, do you really need to be spending like hundreds or even thousands of dollars on these fancy language programs?
You know, Mr. Soberg introduces us to Sarah, a 25-year-old cafe worker who had this big dream of becoming a tour guide.
I love it.
But she just didn't have a lot of extra cash to throw around.
Right.
But Mr. Soberg told her straight up, money isn't everything. There are so many amazing free resources available, and he encouraged her to explore them.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, for starters, he recommended language learning apps, things like Duolingo or Memrise. Have you heard of those?
Yeah.
They're great for building vocabulary and grammar skills, and the best part is they're free.
Oh, that's awesome.
Right. And they're super accessible. Like, you can literally learn English on your phone while you're waiting for the bus.
Totally. But what about speaking practice? You can't really have a conversation with an app.
True. But there's this whole world of free online communities out there. Mr. Soberg told Sarah to look into language exchange groups and find online partners to practice speaking with. Like real people from all over the world who want to learn English too.
Oh, I love that idea.
It's such a cool way to connect with other cultures too. And it's totally free.
It's like you're creating your own little English-speaking environment.
Exactly. And you know what? Through all of this free stuff that she did, Sarah actually became fluent in English and landed her dream job as a tour guide.
No way. Talk about a success story. That's amazing.
Right. It just shows you that you don't need to spend a fortune to learn English. The resources are out there. You just got to be willing to look for them.
Totally. So for our listeners, what's one free resource that you can start using today? There's no excuse to wait.
I mean, even 15 minutes a day can make a huge difference.
Okay, myth number 4.
Oh.
You must live in an English-speaking country to learn English.
This one can be so discouraging for people.
Right, like I have to move across the world just to learn this language.
Exactly, it feels limiting.
Totally.
Yeah.
Mr. Soberg tells this story about Ricardo, a 30-year-old farmer from Brazil who had never left his village.
Wow.
But he loved English language action films. And guess what? He found ways to bring English into his life without ever setting foot outside of Brazil.
That's amazing.
Right. So I'm curious, how did he do it? Like, what kind of creative solutions are we talking about here?
Well, first off, he started watching those action films with English subtitles.
Ah, clever.
Right. It helps train your ear to the rhythm of the language.
Makes sense.
And he took it a step further. He started labeling everyday objects around his house with their English names.
So he's like creating his own little English world right there in his village.
Totally. And then, of course, there's the power of the internet. He connected with online language partners from all over the world.
Oh, that's so cool.
Right. Practicing speaking, building confidence, and he even made a conscious effort to think in English throughout the day.
Wow. So all of this effort, did it actually pay off?
Oh, totally. Big time. So one day, this group of international volunteers came to his village, and Ricardo was the only one who could communicate with them. He gave them a tour of his farm, and they were blown away by his fluency.
Wow. That's incredible. So even without leaving his village, he managed to achieve a level of fluency that surprised even native English speakers.
Right. It really challenges that idea that you have to physically be in an English-speaking country to learn the language.
Totally. So for our listeners out there, how can you bring English into your everyday life, no matter where you live? It's all about getting creative.
Think outside the box. There are so many opportunities waiting to be discovered.
I love that. Okay, myth number 5. You need to learn all the grammar rules before speaking English. This is one that I know a lot of learners struggle with.
It can be so intimidating.
It is. It's like this idea that you have to be a grammar expert before you can even open your mouth.
And it prevents so many people from even trying.
Exactly. But Mr. Soberg tells this story about Elena, a 19-year-old university student who was so scared of making grammar mistakes that she avoided speaking English altogether.
It's like she was frozen in place by fear.
Right. But Mr. Soberg has this really cool way of debunking this myth. He says, think about babies. Yeah, babies. Like they learn to speak before they even know what grammar is. They listen, they imitate, they start babbling, and eventually they figure it out.
That's so true. They don't worry about making mistakes.
Exactly. They're just focused on communicating. And that's the key. So Mr. Soberg encouraged Elena to embrace this childlike approach to language learning, to start speaking even if her grammar wasn't perfect.
So it's more about focusing on getting your message across.
Exactly. Communication over perfection. And as she started to use the language more freely, guess what? She started to pick up those grammar rules naturally through practice and exposure. She didn't even have to study them.
That's so interesting.
Right. And her big breakthrough came when she had to engage with a Canadian guest speaker at her university. She realized that confidence is more important than perfect grammar when it comes to effective communication.
It's about connecting with people.
Exactly. So for all of you listening who are waiting to be perfect before you speak, here's a challenge. What can you say right now, even if it's not grammatically perfect?
Just go for it.
Don't let the fear of making mistakes hold you back.
You might surprise yourself. Okay, now on to myth number 6. If you make mistakes, people will laugh at you.
It's such a common fear, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
It can really prevent people from speaking up and practicing.
Absolutely. It's like this deep-seated fear of judgment.
But Mr. Soberg, he has this really cool analogy to help reframe this fear. He compares learning English to a child learning to ride a bike.
I love that analogy.
Right. We don't laugh at kids when they wobble and fall off their bikes. We cheer them on. We encourage them to keep trying.
Exactly. And Mr. Soberg uses this story of a 32-year-old nurse named Fatima. She needed English for her work, but she was terrified of making mistakes in front of her colleagues.
Oh, I can totally relate to that.
Right. It's like the workplace can be so high pressure.
Especially when you're trying to communicate in a language you're still learning, like the stakes feel so high.
Exactly. But Mr. Soberg really helped Fatima to shift her perspective. He encouraged her to practice in a safe environment, to learn from her mistakes, and most importantly, to focus on communication, not perfection.
So it's more about getting your message across than speaking flawlessly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And guess what? Her colleagues were super supportive. They understood she was making an effort and were happy to help her along the way.
It makes such a difference to have that kind of support.
Totally. It creates this safe space to learn and grow.
And eventually, Fatima got to a point where she could confidently give a presentation in English to applause.
Wow. Talk about a confidence boost.
Right. It's amazing what happens when we let go of that fear of making mistakes.
So listeners, if you're holding back because you're afraid of messing up, remember this. Mistakes are just part of the process. They're not the end of the world.
In fact, they're how we learn.
Embrace those mistakes, learn from them, and keep going. You've got this. Now let's move on to myth number 7, which can be a sensitive one.
Oh yeah, which one?
This idea that if your accent is not perfect, your English is worthless.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
It is. Because it really makes people feel ashamed of their accents.
And it makes them think they have to erase a part of themselves.
Right. It's like they're being told to hide who they are.
Exactly. But you know, an accent is not a deficiency.
It's part of what makes your voice unique.
Totally. So, Mr. Soberg shares this story about Maria, a marketing manager from Brazil. She was really self-conscious about her accent.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine there's so much pressure to sound a certain way.
Right. Like there's this ideal way of speaking English that everyone's supposed to strive for, but what is that even?
Exactly. But Mr. Soberg helped Maria to see her accent as a part of her identity.
Like something to be celebrated?
Exactly. Instead of trying to sound like someone else, he encouraged her to focus on clarity and confidence, speaking slowly, deliberately, making sure her message was understood.
So clear communication over accent perfection.
Precisely. He also had her listen to different English accents from all over the world.
To show her how diverse the language really is.
Right. And in the end, Maria realized that her colleagues valued her for her communication skills and her unique perspective. Accent and all.
That's fantastic. It's a good reminder that we don't have to lose ourselves to be understood.
Exactly. So for our listeners, embrace your voice, your accent, your story. It's all part of what makes you special.
Now let's move on to myth number 8. It's about vocabulary.
Okay. What about vocabulary?
You need to memorize tons of vocabulary to speak English well.
Oh, I think a lot of people get stuck on this one.
They feel overwhelmed, like they need to know every single word in the dictionary before they can have a conversation.
Totally. It's paralyzing.
So Mr. Soberg tells this story about James, an engineer. He had memorized hundreds of words, but still struggled to speak English. Like he knew the words, but he couldn't use them.
It's like he was missing that bridge between knowledge and application.
Exactly. So Mr. Soberg helped James to shift his focus from memorizing isolated words to learning practical phrases and expressions. You know, things he could actually use in everyday conversations. And he encouraged James to practice those phrases in real life situations, you know, not just in his head.
So it's about learning vocabulary and context, right? Like how you would actually use it in real life.
Exactly. And guess what happened? James started to feel more confident because he was actually using the language, not just memorizing it.
That makes sense. It's like you can have all the tools in the world, but if you don't know how to use them, they're not going to do you much good.
Right. So listeners, if you're stuck in vocabulary memorization mode, try shifting your focus to using the words you already know.
Start small, build up from there, and don't be afraid to experiment.
Now let's tackle a myth that's super relevant in our digital age.
Ooh, okay. Well, let's hear it.
Watching movies and TV shows in English without practicing any other methods is enough.
I feel like this one's tempting for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, who doesn't love a good Netflix binge? It's easy to convince yourself that you're learning while you're watching your favorite shows.
But is it really enough?
So Mr. Soberg tells this story about Lucy, a marketing professional who loved watching English language shows. But even though she watched a ton of TV, she still struggled to speak English herself.
It's like she could understand what she was hearing, but couldn't produce the language herself.
Exactly. So Mr. Soberg encouraged Lucy to balance her passive watching with active practice. Things like repeating lines from the shows, imitating the pronunciation and intonation, even having imaginary conversations with the characters.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
Right. It's all about engaging with the language in a more interactive way.
So it's not enough to just be a passive observer. You have to actively participate in the learning process.
Exactly. And he reminded Lucy that watching TV is just one piece of the puzzle. To really become fluent, she needed to incorporate other learning methods like reading, writing, and especially speaking practice.
So listeners, if you love watching English language media, keep doing it. It's a great way to get exposed to the language. But don't forget to make it an active learning experience. Repeat those lines, discuss the content with others, and try to use those new words and phrases you're learning in your own conversations.
Make the language come alive.
Exactly. Okay, now for our final myth of the day.
The grand finale.
Myth number 10. If you practice for a few months and don't see progress, you'll never be able to learn.
Ooh, this one can be so discouraging.
It is, especially when you hit those plateaus. It's easy to feel like giving up. Like maybe you're just not cut out for learning English.
Totally. But Mr. Soberg is here to reassure us that slow progress is totally normal.
So it's not a sign of failure.
Not at all. He tells this story about Lena, a doctor who was feeling super discouraged because she felt like she wasn't making much progress after 6 months of studying.
6 months is a long time to put in the effort and not see the results you're hoping for.
Right. But Mr. Soberg explained to her that language learning takes time. Like, our brains literally need time to adjust, to create new neural pathways, to process all this new information.
So it's like a physical process too.
It is. And he told her that those plateaus, those times when it feels like you're not moving forward, those are actually a sign that your brain is working hard behind the scenes.
So it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing.
Exactly. And he encouraged Lena to celebrate those small wins along the way.
It's so important to acknowledge those little victories.
Right.
It helps to keep you motivated.
Totally. And most importantly, he reminded her that consistency is key. Regular practice, even if it's just for a few minutes each day, is way more effective than cramming every now and then.
So it's like building a habit, right? Making English a part of your daily routine.
Exactly. And you know what? Lena kept at it, and eventually she saw that consistent effort really does pay off. She realized that if she had given up, she would have missed out on the incredible feeling of achieving her goals.
I love that. So for all of you listening who are feeling discouraged, remember this. Slow progress is still progress. Don't give up. Keep practicing, keep learning, and celebrate every step forward, no matter how small it may seem. I think it's so easy to get caught up in wanting to see those big results quickly.
Oh, totally. But it's important to remember that those breakthroughs often come after those periods of what feels like no progress.
So we've really dug into these 10 common myths about speaking English.
And busted them wide open.
And I think what's really cool is that we've heard from real people, like Mr. Soberg's students.
Yeah, their stories are so powerful.
They are, like people who overcame their fears and defied expectations.
And proved that age, background, money, those things don't have to hold you back.
Exactly. I mean, we've heard from people of all ages, from all walks of life, who've achieved fluency.
It's pretty inspiring, right?
It is. I think it's a testament to the fact that anyone can learn to speak English.
Absolutely.
If they're willing to put in the effort. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from all these stories is the power of mindset. Like believing in yourself, embracing the journey, and not giving up when things get tough.
You know, those are the things that really make a difference.
Absolutely. So for our listeners out there, now that we've busted these myths, what's one small step you can take today to move closer to your English speaking goals?
It doesn't have to be something huge. Even just 5 minutes of practice is better than nothing.
Totally. And remember, the journey of learning English is not just about mastering a language.
It's about opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
Connecting with people from different cultures.
Expanding your horizons.
So keep learning, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself.
You've got this.
That's it for our deep dive into the world of English-speaking myths. We hope you've enjoyed it.
And learned a lot.
And until next time, happy learning, everyone.